Hi guys, it's Troy at the Full Setup, back with another benchmark review. Now for today's video, I will be benchmarking the brand new GTX 1660 Ti with the Ryzen 2600 at 1080p ultra settings. I will be testing 11 games for you today with a mix of stock and overclock results for you. Over the next few weeks, I will also be benchmarking 1440p and ultra wide performance. So if you want to see those videos, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And as a huge thank you to all of you, I'm also running a competition for a free DEEPCOOL L240 liquid cooler, and you can find out how to enter at the end of this video. As for the GTX 1660 Ti, I'm using a PNY gaming OC with 6GB of GDDR6. This 1660 Ti has a boost rating of 1815 MHz, but as you can see on screen here, out of the box boosts are much higher if you keep the card nice and cool. Now there is a full specification list in the description if you want to take a look, but I'll just give you a brief overview. I'm using a Ryzen 2600 with 16GB of 3200 MHz DDR4, but I am using some pretty tight manual sub timings on an Asus X370 crosshair motherboard. Before we start with the review, I would like to thank today's sponsor GVG Mall. Now I'm sure you're like myself and you have spent many an hour planning your dream PC builds, only to be left crying when you have to add your Windows operating system at over £100, which normally results in a CPU or GPU downgrade. Well, not anymore. GVG Mall offers some of the best pricing on Windows 10 Pro license keys, and they have kindly given me a 20% discount code to share with you. The reason they're able to offer Windows so cheap is that they do not provide you with any physical media and only provide you with a license key. But don't worry, you can download the installer from Microsoft's website, then simply install Windows on a USB stick and you are good to go. As well as Windows and Office, GVG Mall also offers some great prices on games too, and there is a link to their website in the description. So let's start with the stock versus overclock performance then. Now I want to talk about overclocking a little bit more than I normally do. Now my GPU overclocks that I do are, I would say, an overclock that anyone could achieve. I could probably push all my overclocks a little bit further, but I really just want to, set something that all of you guys can use at home. Now as for the core on this graphics card, because it is already boosting quite high, I've only added 110 MHz to the core. Now memory is a bit of a weird one really, because when you look at the RTX line of graphics cards, their GDDR6 is all running at 14 gigabits per second, as the 1660 Ti is only running at 12 gigabit per second, meaning that you do actually have quite a lot of headroom for memory overclocking. My maximum memory overclock was actually about 1750 MHz, but the one thing I did notice is that it didn't actually give me any more performance gains than setting it to 1000 MHz. Now I'm not saying you won't find any performance gains, I just didn't notice any, so I thought, well, why stress the GPU more than I actually need to, so I've stuck with 1000 MHz. Anyway, as for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we're running at Ultra with TAA enabled, and with both the CPU and GPU at stock settings, we have a minimum of 62 and an average of 81 frames per second. With the CPU still at stock, but with the GPU overclocked, we have a minimum of 65 and an average of 85 frames per second. Overclocking the CPU to 4.2 GHz, but leaving the GPU at stock, gives us a minimum of 64 and an average of 86 frames per second. Overclocking the CPU and the GPU gives us a minimum of 65 and an average of 88 frames per second. Far Cry New Dawn, again at ultra settings with TAA enabled. For all stock, we have a minimum of 64 and an average of 83 frames per second. Leaving the CPU at stock but overclocking the GPU gives us a minimum of 64 and an average of 85 frames per second. Overclocking the CPU but leaving the graphics card at stock settings gives a minimum of 76 and an average of 92 frames per second. With the whole system now overclocked, we have a minimum of 79 and an average of 97 frames per second. And finally, Shadow of War, again at ultra settings with TAA enabled. For all stock, we have a minimum of 48 and an average of 81 frames per second. For stock, but with an overclocked GPU, we have a minimum of 51 and an average of 86 frames per second. Overclocking the CPU, but leaving the GPU stock gives us a minimum of 49 and an average of 81 frames per second. And with the whole system overclocked, we have a minimum of 52 and an average of 87 frames per second. Now for the rest of the benchmark, we're just going to focus on gameplay footage, and apart from Battlefield at the end of the video, we're going to leave the CPU at stock settings for you, as I know that's what most of you are using. But I'm going to leave the GPU overclocked, and as explained in all of my videos, to the point that I'm actually getting a little bit bored of saying this now, the reason is because I record with Nvidia Shadow, which loses about 5 frames per second, overclocking gains about 5 frames per second, so they sort of cancel each other out. So what you're actually looking at on screen right now is probably closer to stock settings than it is overclocked. And as you can see, this system has no issue running Forza Horizon 4. We're at ultra settings and frame rates are always above 100 frames per second. Moving on to PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Now this first bit of PUBG footage you're seeing on screen here is at the settings I like to play at. So they're sort of competitive settings. It's everything set to low, but I have draw distance set to ultra. And as you can see, there's a little bit of bottleneck in here, so it may well help you out if you overclock the CPU to get the FPS up even higher. But as you can see, the FPS is very high indeed, generally always above 130 FPS, making really good use of my 144Hz panel. Cranking up all the settings to ultra and the game still plays very well indeed. Frame rates for the most are always above 100 FPS, so it does run this game very well. Now, I said in my last video I was a little bit gutted about all the hardware and all the games that have come out recently. I know for you guys you absolutely love that, but it hasn't really given me a lot of time to play games outside of benchmarking, and I did manage to play Metro Exodus for a couple of hours last night, and I must say I am thoroughly enjoying it. Now, one thing you're going to find with Metro is that the frame rate does vary a bit, so I don't have any footage of what I'm talking about right now, but when you're just sort of talking to people and getting mission objectives, you'll generally see the frame rate sitting around 60 FPS, even at ultra settings. But as soon as you sort of get out there and start wandering around, the frame rates are always sort of around the sort of 80 to 100 FPS mark. And I must say, this game still looks absolutely beautiful, even with ray tracing turned off. Another game I haven't really had much time to play, really to get the grips of. I'm a total noob when it comes to Apex Legends. So we're at all low settings here, and one thing I've noticed is it seems to not go above 144 Hz. I've got VSync turned off in the game, and I've got VSync turned off in the video control panel, but I just can't seem to go past 144 frames per second. So I'd be interested if any of you are having the same issue, but it runs low very well indeed. Cranking the game up to very high settings is going to have some frame dips here, but still, this game does play very well. Bigs up to Respawn. I think you've done a really good job on this game. I mean, you're going to find averages sort of always going between about 75 and just over 100 frames per second, depending sort of what area of the map you're in and the kind of intensity of the gameplay you are playing. Apart from the shockingly bad performance of Anthem at the beginning of this video, really interested to see what your performance is like in that game. I would actually also be really interested in what settings you play Assassin's Creed Odyssey at. Me personally, even though this graphics card can run at ultra high settings, I do prefer to play this game at very high settings, so I'm not getting constant dips under 60 FPS. Even though the game's still playable very well at 45 frames per second, these are just the settings that I like to play it at. And I think as well with the battles that they've put into this game where you've got loads of AI characters on screen, this just seems to be the settings that I really like to play this game at. So there were the benchmark scores, and as you can see, the GTX 1660 Ti when paired with Ryzen 2600 is an absolute top performer at 1080p gameplay, and I think you'll really enjoy this card. But now we come to the bit of the video where it's like, would I recommend this graphics card? And this is a little bit difficult for me, because at the moment the 1616 Ti is probably selling for maybe 5 to 10% more than it should be selling for. And we also have 5 other cards within the price range, sort of 200 to 330 pounds to compare it to, making a decision even harder. So I want to talk about those choices. So for the first two choices then, the GTX 1060 and the RX 590, which is selling for anywhere between about 200 and 250 pounds. Now, I can't really recommend those cards at all. Can't recommend the 1060 because this is the card that's replacing it. Can't recommend the RX 590, even though it is coming with free games. You're getting about 25% more performance out of a GTX 1660 Ti, so I can't recommend that. But what about the bigger boys? What about those graphics cards? Let's start with the Vega 56. Now, we know that's been price reduced to about 250 to 275 pounds. We don't know how long that offer is going to be available for. And again, you get free games, which is sort of a pro. 8 GB of HBM memory, so that's a pro. But then we get to the cons, and the cons are pretty big for me. The power consumption of the Vega 56 is pretty high. It's a reference model, so it's going to run very hot. I had a reference Vega 56, and I just couldn't bear the sound of that graphics card. And also, to get the best performance out of it, you're going to have to do some undervolting, overclocking, maybe a BIOS mod, tweaks to the voltage. That's not for everyone. You know, most people, 99% of the people, are just going to buy a graphics card, plug it in your computer and start playing games. So that's why I can't recommend the Vega 56. So those 3 were all pretty easy not to recommend. The other 2 is where it gets a little bit more difficult over this graphics card. So what about the GTX 1070 then? So that graphics card selling for the same price. You can pick it up for about £275 and you get 2GB more VRAM and they perform about the same in games. So I could see why you would say 2GB more VRAM, I'm going to buy that graphics card, and you know, I totally agree with you on that. For me, just from a content creating perspective, I would go with the Turing cards because I've always streamed using the HVenc encoder. I don't like to use CPU streaming because of the performance hit that you get. And even though we're getting more cores and threads now, it's still quite a big performance hit. The HVenc on Turing cards, there's many reviews and videos on this, is literally almost on par with CPU encoding now. So if you are someone that likes to do Twitch, streaming, any sort of content creation, I would pick the Turing card, the GTX 1660 Ti, over the GTX 1070. So that was an awkward one. What about spending £50 more and buying an RTX 2060? To be honest, to me, that's a really easy decision. I would buy the RTX 2060. I can't remember quite what it is, but I think you're going to get about 15% more performance out of that graphics card. You're also going to get DLSS support and basic ray tracing as well. So I would 100% take that graphics card. So how do you enter the competition? And it's really simple. You've got two things to do. Firstly, you need to subscribe to the channel and hit my notification bell so you're going to get notifications to all my great content that's coming over the next few months. Then you need to get over to my Discord server. Now there's a link to my Discord in the description for this video. As you can see here, there is a server where you can enter the competition. All you have to do is leave a comment. Please, I don't want a massive discussion on there. Just a comment saying enter is more than enough, and that will get you in the competition. And the competition ends on the 17th of March. Anyway, that's it from me today. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you disliked the video, if there's anything else you would like to see in the video, let me know in the comments section. And please don't forget to subscribe and make sure you enter that competition.